Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Mornings with Matthew. I'm Matthew Tragesser, your host, and today we'll be discussing the recent ICE immigration enforcement operations from over the weekend, as well as the Trump administration's proposal for a new asylum rule intending to end asylum abuse in our country. Joining me today to discuss these topics is Preston Huennekens from our Government Relations Department. Preston, good to see you again.
Yeah, always happy to be here.
Okay, so let's begin by discussing this ICE enforcement operation that occurred recently. So what we know is that they selected, ICE selected 10 cities across the country, LA, Chicago, New York, among others, and they were targeting up to 2,000 people with final orders of removal. And this obviously got a lot of pushback from people across the country, from cable TV to social media. I mean, it was a very hot topic, but I wanted to get your perspective on something that Trump kind of talked about throughout this whole process, which was, at first he said he was going to deport millions of people. Then his administration said, you know what, he's actually only going to deport people with final orders of removal, which was, around 1 million. And now they targeted up to 2,000 individuals. So what are we supposed to think here? Do you think the president kind of back down after hearing the pushback from this, or was there something else going on that we're not totally aware of?
I'm sure it's a little bit of both. And, something that a lot of people forget is that these, enforcement surges, they usually call them, they happen all the time. If you subscribe to ICE's, newsletter, they send out almost every day, surge activity in Los Angeles nets, 200 aliens.
Mm-hmm.
So they do these kinds of raids a lot, and they're usually very targeted, like the president kind of explained, going after people with final orders of removal who have no other legal recourse to remain in the country.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't people that are just kind of navigating the court system. They've already gone through it. A judge has found them removable. They need to go. And so I think it was just rare, though, that the president was highlighting this one group of them instead of, because they happen all the time.
Exactly. No, I think you're spot on with that. I mean, these are swift operations. They're not going to be advertised every time ICE officials, go hunt down people that, have final orders of removal. I mean, this happens almost every week, I'd say. It's interesting why he highlighted this particular one. And I don't understand why the media said, hey, look, nothing really formalized on Sunday. There was very few ICE agents present in these communities, but I also felt like ICE was not going to make themselves, appear to the public eye and to cameras during this operation. They wanted to be quick in and out and do this. And also, these raids were, I should call them immigration enforcement operations, because they're not really raids despite what the mainstream media calls them to be. But, they don't happen. They're not supposed to happen just in one day. It's a process. And I think a lot of people are missing out on this aspect where it's not like you have 24 hours and then, okay, we're done. It's a process that's been still going on now. But another thing that was interesting that I found was, on these same cable TV stations and on social media, there were a lot of images of families and children, and as if ICE were only targeting these groups of people. Who are these ICE agents targeting during, an enforcement operation like this? Who are these people?
Yeah,
is it really the children and families?
No, it's. I would imagine it's probably mostly single adult males who have, again, they've gone through the court, and even if they are families, for better or for worse, they've gone through the court system, and an immigration judge has found them removable. So, and when people talk about raids, that would indicate ICE going into, like a poultry plant and just arresting everyone working there.
Right.
That is very rare.
Yeah.
That rarely happens. What ICE usually does is that they know where, they for the most part know where people live who have these final orders, and they'll just go and arrest them. It's not, they're not dragging people out of homes kicking and screaming. It's very professional for the and it's, of course, just hysterics from the mainstream media talking about it.
What people don't realize is, right now there's 1.1 million people, illegal aliens in the country, who have final orders of removal, and the administration was only targeting 2,000 people out of that group. So it's a very small percentage, and these 2,000 are probably the people that have committed the most serious crimes in addition to crossing over illegally. And even last year, when here's an ICE chart I'm looking at here from fiscal year 2018 of the criminal charges from people removed from the country. And, I'm seeing these top 5 categories here, and I see DUI, dangerous drugs, traffic offenses, assault, and larceny. And, I mean, these are just not, these are crimes in addition to them crossing illegally. It's not just, okay, well, if you cross illegally, you're going to be immediately removed right now. I mean, these are in addition to that.
Right, and generally, ICE wouldn't know who you are if you were an otherwise law-abiding, illegal alien. If you just come into the country and kind of just keep your head down, for the most part, look at how that population has exploded in the past 30 years. But for ICE to really be coming after you, you have prior criminal history.
Absolutely. And what I will say, though, is, with all these sanctuary cities and jurisdictions that we keep seeing growing and growing over the past, decade, they've really sprouted up. I mean, isn't that creating a public safety risk for not only, U.S. citizens, law-abiding immigrants in these, major cities, but then, for immigrants who also reside in these cities? Because a lot of these dangerous criminals, let's say MS-13 gang members in Chicago or New York or wherever, they prey on people from their own countries, from El Salvador or Guatemala. So it's almost like these mayors, by not cooperating with ICE officials, and I see here that the Chicago mayor banned ICE from accessing its city's databases. I mean, that's just encouraging more criminal behavior. It's a public safety threat to people in the city. I mean, I just why aren't they recognizing that?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It particularly affects immigrant communities because MS-13, they're not shaking down, Main Street shops. They're going to, the stores and the businesses that are operating in the immigrant communities and shaking them down and, terrorizing their children.
Yeah.
And also, even again with anytime you have sanctuary cities, with restrictive policies that keep ICE from, making targeted arrests, let's say, that then means that ICE has to come in and make at-large arrests. So instead of arresting someone in the controlled setting of a jail or a courthouse, something like that, that's when they're then having to go in to the person's home. And if they find other illegal aliens living in the home, they're not just going to ignore that. They're going to arrest them too. So it's a very when you actually apply these sanctuary policies, it actually ends up hurting, the people that the politicians claim they're helping.
And the other thing too, I think this is not talked about at all, is the cost of illegal immigration to these cities. And here's a chance, just billions and millions of dollars, and these mayors could say, hey, let's get rid of that cost, but they don't. And think about all that money that could be allocated to, I don't know, the inner city schools or healthcare programs or infrastructure in a lot of these cities that are crumbling. I mean, you look at New York, Chicago. I mean,
or look at look at the school. Look at the school system in Los Angeles.
Yeah,
that's completely
LA,
collapsing.
Huge homeless populations all across the West Coast. I don't know why they don't realize that that's also a factor. I mean, maybe they do realize it and they just ignore it for political reasons. But then there's also the thought that with these sanctuary cities, illegal aliens aren't going to report crimes. They're going to feel like there's a chilling effect. I've seen zero empirical evidence of that.
No, there's none, and it's actually really funny. Whenever there are congressional hearings about this, you'll always have one congressman say, "Oh, this is a chilling effect," and as the witnesses, the sheriffs and whatnot, they usually say, "No, these people, the sanctuary policy, that doesn't really change anything one way or the other. In fact." They're the ones that want these criminals gone because they're the ones being terrorized by them. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, people don't realize, too, illegal aliens actually have the ability to get, ultimately citizenship through UNT visas.
If you report crimes.
UNT visas, if you cooperate in an investigation or you're a victim of a crime, you can become eligible for these. And so it's kind of an incentive to, hey, let's talk to the local police authorities if something did happen. And completely I'm not sure what's going on there, but it's something that is not talked about enough. The other thing regarding these ICE enforcement operations that occurred recently is, Obama did similar things to this when he was in office for 2 terms, and yet there was little uproar. when this happened. He was called the deporter in chief between 2009 and between 2009 and 2015. His administration removed more than 2.5 million people, which doesn't include the number of people who self-deported. And this number is actually more than any other administration in history, and that 2.5 million number is more than the sum of all presidents in the 20th century. So you can see clearly how he could be labeled the deporter in chief. But yet, little uproar when all these were occurring. Thoughts on that?
He didn't brag about it on Twitter.
Well, yeah.
It was very President Obama's immigration enforcement operations were largely kept out of the news cycle because the administration didn't prioritize them, which is very different from the current administration under President Trump, which they're usually the first ones to announce when they've done this. He's made it much more a part of his political program than President Obama did. So there's reasons for it, even though, like you just said, President Obama was very active in removing illegal aliens.
What about going off of this still? If we don't deport people after they're issued a final order of removal, they've been through they've been given due process in the judicial process. Isn't that just a slap to the face to our country's judicial system? I mean,
it is.
Blatantly ignore, a court order saying you got to go now. You've been given the due process, a fair trial. It
makes our not only our immigration court system but our entire immigration framework look silly. And I think it's very telling how big of a problem it is that we do have over 1 million people who have gone through the system who are removable that are still living here.
Yep.
And I think that is a cry for help that that EOR, our immigration court system, needs help. We need more judges. We need more ICE agents that are able to take those people that have gone through that process and remove them. And
as Tom Homan, the former ICE director, said at a hearing recently, and this is all over the internet now, but I mean, he basically said, when he was in law enforcement, he had to separate children from their families, sometimes because the father was arrested for something, and it happens on a daily basis. It's I don't think because you have a family and you're an illegal alien, you should be exempted from that. If you commit a heinous crime, you need to be removed. I mean, it happens on a daily basis, whether it's with the local police, the FBI, U.S. Marshals. I mean, people do get separated because
right.
Of crimes.
If you're driving drunk down the road with your kid and you get pulled over, the kid isn't going to go to the drunk tank with you.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's a great point. I'm glad that he brought that up in that hearing.
I encourage our listeners out there to check that clip out. I mean, it's all over the internet, and I thought it was a very good point brought by Tom Homan. So now a large reason why we have so many illegal aliens in the country is the fact that our asylum laws have so many issues with them, and I know Congress has been fighting back and forth over how to fix them. But in order to help reduce these asylum claims, especially the meritless ones that we're seeing, especially in the past decade, the Trump administration proposed a new asylum rule that requires migrants to apply for asylum in the first safe country they enter before entering the U.S. Of course, within hours after this rule was released, the ACLU, among other civil liberties groups, tried to block this, and I guess it's still pending. But there's immediate resistance from this. The AP, Associated Press, had a headline that said, "quote Trump moved to effectively end asylum at our southern border," end quote. Would you say this rule effectively ends asylum, or is this kind of an embellishing headline?
It depends. If it withstands court challenges, it certainly will lessen the number of people who can apply for asylum in the U.S. And in the rule, there are cutouts and ways that people who are have traveled through can still apply, but by and large, most people wouldn't be able to apply for asylum. And people forget. We're a sovereign country. We can determine what our asylum laws are. And actually, there was there was a quote from a minister in Mexico who
Uh-huh.
he said, he goes, well, I don't really like that rule. It seems kind of silly, but the U.S. can essentially, the U.S. can do what it wants in regards to who they let in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, and I think it's going to be very telling, where the court case is filed, and if that ruling comes out soon or not, if they put an injunction on it. So
Yeah. I mean, for our listeners out there, the president and the administration has the full legal authority to do this under the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the INA. And also with this rule, there are exemptions to this. I mean, I read that if you are a victim of human trafficking or you've been denied asylum in one of the countries you come up through, whether it's Northern Triangle countries or Mexico, you can still apply for asylum. So it's not just a blanket kind of, no one's applying for asylum. I mean, what they're doing is actually prioritizing asylees who are bona fide asylees, people who are actually, they have a case as to why they're being politically persecuted, or based on the 5 characteristics, which are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership to a social group. In fact, the matter is, and we've been stressing this for months now, years. As an asylee, you can't pick and choose where you want to go. You're supposed to go to the first safe country outside of the country you're fleeing from, and that doesn't really happen because a lot of these migrants are economic migrants trying to seek better wages and, improved economic conditions, which unfortunately doesn't qualify them for asylum in this country.
Right, and that's one of the biggest issues is how we have interpreted that last asylum category, membership of a particular social group, which has now been expanded to I'm scared of gangs.
Yeah.
And gangs are a horrible part of life in Central America. They're also a horrible part of life in the United States.
Yep.
And whether or not that warrants asylum is something that I think needs to be debated seriously. Because that's for the most part, every single one of them are not coming because of political persecution.
Yeah.
They're not coming because of sexual orientation. It's because of, like you said, they're economic migrants who are obviously want to leave, and so that's you just have to tighten up that definition.
So, do you envision if this rule goes actually into effect? I know it's a big uphill battle, but do you expect, I guess, apprehension numbers at the southern border to dip down after this, or is it too early to tell?
It might be too early to tell, and I think numbers will dip anyway because it is in the middle of the summer. We traditionally see that every year that numbers do dip. But it takes a few months usually for, our policies to, get out into the streets in Central America for smugglers to learn about them and tell their clients about them and stuff. So it's, I think it may be, 2 or 3 months before we see, if assuming that this, is in place, is not enjoined, goes through. I think it would take a little bit of time to see if it does, but it'll certainly be interesting to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners out there, I mean, I know this is kind of been talked about frequently, but there is a lot of asylum abuse at our southern border right now. I mean, I see a stat here where the median asylum grant rate across all immigration courts in the country hovers around 11%. And again, people have the right to seek asylum. We're not saying you don't have the right, but they can't be based off of meritless claims. And the fact that, that stat shows, a lot of these just don't have a lot of basis behind them. And it's sad, but it's 11%. It's a very low number that's actually granted. Our backlog right now is over more than 900,000 cases. And, with a few hundred immigration judges adjudicating these, it takes years for them to actually get, met.
Right, and particularly focusing on that 11% of people who do have, meritorious claims, it makes the process longer for them, people who actually need our protection. Yeah. And when you have all of these other meritless claims, it just makes that process harder for people who actually, the U.S. is meant to help through our asylum system.
So obviously, like I mentioned before, this rule is going to have a big uphill battle. Who knows if it'll actually go into effect. Everything that the administration tries to do is stymied by activist judicial courts, by open borders groups. But what else could the administration do to help decrease these meritless claims and, regain control of the border if this can't go into effect?
So, and I kind of touched on this earlier, and it's something that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions attempted to do, which is change the definition of membership in a particular social group. I think that would go a really long way in making sure that people who are truly economic migrants can't come in and claim through that. I think that you really have to have specific criteria for asylum, which is what we already have with political opinion, with religion, with race, that kind of thing. But when you have this kind of catch-all, ambiguous category, that is just a green light for abuse. And so I think that maybe Attorney General Barr could issue a policy memo to Department of Justice staff saying we only consider the X, Y, and Z as like certain categories. We don't we're not considering fear of gangs as a
absolutely. And I know this is interesting. Lindsey Graham actually had a bill. I'm not sure. Maybe you would know the status of this, but he had a bill where essentially had a provision where migrants had to apply for asylum in their home country. Do you know what's the status of that, or is it still
it hasn't been marked up yet, but it's been introduced. It's he's holding it on the Judiciary Committee to go through hearings on it. But that's a big idea that a lot of people have considered is for people that really do want to apply for asylum in the U.S. to have systems set up in their home country so that they don't take that that terrible journey that so many people have died on coming up through Mexico. Have them stay there. We'll adjudicate those claims there, and then people who are found with merit we'll bring them to the United States under asylum.
I think that would be a good kind of strategy that we haven't really seen yet. Like you said, it prevents migrants from taking, the 2,000-mile trip to the southern border in extreme heat with the cartels and human traffickers. I mean, it's that journey in itself is just, it's almost like you are kind of giving up your life. Like you might not come out of here alive. And so it's very hazardous. Hopefully that rule, it's still pretty new. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen with it. But I think that it does address a lot that could help, I guess, mitigate these surges in asylum claims that we've been seeing. I mean, between fiscal year 2008 to fiscal year 2018, there's been a 278% jump in these asylum claims. Obviously, there's something going on that it needs to be addressed and kind of revamp the policies behind this.
Right, and it's actually fascinating that it took this long for us to kind of see the effect of the asylum loopholes. Which is interesting.
Yeah. Great stuff, as always, from Ferris, Preston, Huennekens from our Government Relations Department. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Tune in next week for another edition of Mornings with Matthew. Please check us out on our SoundCloud page at fair.federation for more podcasts, and also fairus.org for additional material on immigration-related news. Thanks, guys, and see you guys next week.